I'd like to give you 12 things you probably don't know or might not know about Jews and Judaism. Hopefully this will be intriguing. If you're not Jewish, this is for you. And if you are Jewish, this is especially for you because I can almost guarantee that some of what I'm going to talk about will surprise you too. Judaism is a tradition that has been misunderstood and mythologized and romanticized, and along the way, much of what is genuinely gorgeous about it has been forgotten, even by Jews. But underneath all of that is one of the oldest continuous spiritual conversations on earth, a conversation that began somewhere around 4,000 years ago and is still going, still arguing, still evolving, still asking the same kinds of questions we ask today. How do we live well? What do we owe each other? What does it mean to belong to something larger than ourselves? So here's what we're going to do. 12 things, some historical, some spiritual, some about identity, some about practice, some about beliefs that will probably surprise you. Where does the word Jew actually come from? It comes from one man. His name was Judah, in Hebrew Yehudah. He was the fourth son of the patriarch Jacob, one of the 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of ancient Israel. One of the tribes. 10 were eventually scattered and lost to history when the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians in the 8th century before the Common Era. What remained was the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, and the people of that kingdom became known as Yehudim, Judeans, Jews. So the word Jew, Yehudi, literally means one from Judah. But here's what's beautiful about that name. Yehudah in Hebrew comes from the root lehodot, which means to give thanks, to acknowledge. When Judah was born, in the book of Genesis, his mother Leah said, "This time I will praise God." She named him Yehudah. I will give thanks. So embedded in the very word Jew, in the very identity of an entire people, is an act of gratitude. Think about that, of all the names that people could have inherited, names of a warrior, a king, a conqueror. Jews are named after the act of giving thanks. 2, the first Jew. So who was the first Jew? Most people would say Moses. Some would say Judah, since that's where the name comes from. And some might say Adam. The very first Jew was Abraham. And that surprises people because Abraham lived hundreds of years before Judah was born and more than 1,000 years before there was a place called Israel or a religion called Judaism. So how's Abraham the first Jew? Well, because Abraham was the first person in our tradition to make a choice. The story in Genesis is striking. God doesn't appear to Abraham in a burst of fire. There's no miracle, there's no sign in the sky. God simply speaks. Lech lecha, the Hebrew words, go forth from your land, from your birthplace, from your parents, your father's home, to a land that I will show you. And Abraham goes, and that's the beginning of this story. He leaves behind everything familiar, his geography, his family, his inherited gods, and he walks into the unknown on the basis of an idea, a calling. The idea is that there's one God and one moral source, one unifying intelligence behind all of creation. That moment, that walking out, that's the founding act of Jewish identity. Number 3, the scattering, what's called the diaspora. For most of Jewish history, most of it, Jews have not only lived in the land of Israel, they've lived elsewhere also. They've lived everywhere else, essentially. The diaspora, from the Greek word meaning scattering, refers to the dispersion of the Jews around the world after the destruction of the Second Temple in the Roman era, the year 70 of the Common Era. Many Jews were scattered throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. Eventually, Jewish communities they formed in places as far-reaching as Iraq, as Yemen, as India, China, Ethiopia, Spain, Germany, Poland, Morocco, the Americas, and yes, of course, in the land of Israel. Now, the popular narrative is that the diaspora was a tragedy, an exile, a punishment. And it was, in part. Jews were expelled. Jews were persecuted. Jews lost languages, communities, sometimes entire lineages. But here's what I want you to consider. The diaspora is also the reason Judaism survived, because Jews were scattered. They were never all in one place where one army, one disaster, one expulsion could annihilate them. Because Jews were scattered, they had to develop portable forms of worship, prayer, instead of sacrifice, study instead of the priesthood, the book instead of the temple, because Jews were scattered. They absorbed and contributed to the cultures around them, becoming uniquely positioned to translate between civilizations. In a sense, the diaspora made the Jewish people who they are, a people whose spiritual homeland is Israel, but whose home is a text, a people whose identity is carried not in a place, but in a conversation that has continued unbroken for 2,000 years. Number 4, the black coats, the black hats, the long coats. If ever you've seen the ultra-Jewish man, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish man, I should say, the long black coat, the wide-brimmed black hat, sometimes a fur hat called a shtreimel, you might assume you're looking at something biblical, something ancient, something that goes back thousands and thousands of years that is quintessentially Jewish. Well, no, you're not. What you're looking at is essentially 18th century Polish and Lithuanian aristocratic dress. The black kaftan, the broad hat, the formal coat. These were the clothes of the nobility in the regions of Eastern Europe where the Hasidic movement was born in the 1700s. Jewish men in those communities adopted that style of dress because it was the dress of the cultured class, the respected class, the learned class, the class that took dignity seriously. And then, and this is the fascinating part, as the rest of Europe modernized, as fashion shifted, as the world moved on, these Jewish communities didn't. They held on to that style. They sanctified it. It became a way of saying, we don't move with the trends, we move with eternity. Number 5, what a Jew looks like. Well, Jewish diversity. When most non-Jews picture a Jew, they tend to picture one specific kind, that man I just described. Let's say pale skin, Eastern European features, maybe with a particular accent or inflection in their voice. This is one kind of Jew, the Ashkenazi, the Jew that's descended from communities that flourished in Germany and France and Poland and Russia, in the rest of Eastern Europe. They became the largest Jewish population in the world by the 20th century, but they are not and never were the only kind of Jews. There are Sephardi Jews descended from the great Jewish communities of Spain and Portugal who were expelled in the 15th century and who were dispersed across the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and the Netherlands. They have their own pronunciation of Hebrew, their own liturgy, their own melodies, their own cuisine, their own music. There are Mizrahi Jews. These are Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, Iraqi Jews, Yemenite Jews, Persian Jews, Moroccan Jews, Egyptian Jews, communities that lived continuously in those lands for 2,500 years, most between 850,000 and 1 million of them were expelled or forced to flee Muslim lands in the 20th century. There are Ethiopian Jews, Beta Yisrael, whose tradition holds that they descend from the meeting of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. There are Bukhari Jews, Bukharian Jews, Indian Jews, Chinese Jews, mountain Jews from the Caucasus. I visited their community in the beautiful Red Town, as it's known, in Azerbaijan. Number 6, I'll say it's the Book of Arguments, the Talmud. If I asked most people to name the holy book of Judaism, you'd say, it's the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Torah, the Tanakh. Well, it's true, but it's only, I'll say, half of the answer. Judaism has essentially 2 scriptures. There's the written scripture, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And there is the oral Torah, a vast body of teachings. When I say vast, this is teaching, interpretation, legal reasoning that was transmitted orally for centuries before becoming written down. The oral Torah was eventually completed. It was compiled into a work known as the Talmud. It's roughly 6,000 pages long. It records the debates and rulings of rabbis spanning hundreds of years. And it's the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, arguably more central today to daily Jewish life than the Bible itself is directly. But here's what makes the Talmud extraordinary and important for us in this year of our lives. It's not a book of answers, it's a book of arguments. Number 7, Tikkun Olam. You may have heard this phrase. It's become very popular. It's a slogan in liberal Judaism, liberal Jewish circles, and beyond. It's usually translated as repairing the world, and it's been adopted to mean something like social justice and activism and service, making the world a better place. And that's true, and it's beautiful, and it's not exactly wrong, but it's also not where the phrase actually comes from. The beach cleanup, an aspect, we could say, of Tikkun Olam, originated somewhere else with different meaning. Tikkun Olam in its original setting comes from 16th century Jewish mysticism, from the Kabbalists of Tzfat in the land of Israel, specifically from the teachings of a great mystic called Isaac Luria. In Luria's mystical cosmology, the act of creation involved a catastrophe. God's infinite light was poured into vessels, and the vessels shattered, sparks of the divine light scattered throughout the material world, hidden in everything around us. The job of human beings then, and particularly of the Jews, is to gather those sparks, to release them, to return them to their source. That's Tikkun Olam, the cosmic repair of a broken creation. Number 8, Shabbat, the Sabbath. Most people think of the Jewish Sabbath as a day of rest, and it is, but that misses what it actually is. The Sabbath is not a vacation. We're not vacating. It's not a recovery day. It's not a Sunday brunch. The Sabbath is a protest. For one full day, from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, traditional Jews stop working. They stop spending, they stop driving, they stop using screens, they stop creating, they stop, period. And in stopping, they make a radical claim. They say, my worth is not what I produce. We say, my value is not what I earn. My identity is not my output. In the ancient world, the idea of a weekly day off was revolutionary. Slaves did not get days off. Workers did not get days off. The Roman world, in that world, they thought it was lazy and bizarre that Jews refused to work 1 day in 7. Number 9 is kosher. Most people know that Jews don't eat pork. Some people know that Jews don't mix meat and milk, meat and dairy. A few people know that Jews don't eat shellfish, but it's maybe less understood why, the reasoning. The popular explanations are usually some version of health and hygiene. Pork carries trichinosis, shellfish spoils quickly, and the laws were practical adaptations to a hot climate. These explanations are appealing. They're also almost certainly wrong. If health were really the reason, Jews would have stopped keeping kosher when refrigeration was invented. They didn't. And many of the kosher laws were nothing to do with hygiene at all, like waiting hours between eating meat and dairy. So what is kosher actually about? It's about consciousness. Judaism takes one of the most basic human mammal acts, eating 3 or more times a day for an entire lifetime, and turns it into a moment of awareness, of asking, where did this come from? Was the animal treated with the dignity owed to a living creature? Is this an act I can do with full integrity, or is this just mindless consumption? The laws of kosher slaughter are remarkably specific, designed to minimize the animal's suffering, conducted by a trained professional. Number 10, chosen, the chosen people. This is one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of Judaism, and it's been weaponized, sometimes by anti-Semites, sometimes even by Jews themselves for thousands of years. When Jews say we are the chosen people, what we do not mean is that we are better, and what we do not mean is that we are favored, and what we do not mean is that we're more loved by God than any other people, or that other peoples are somehow less worthy. What we do mean, and what the text actually says, is that we were chosen for a task. The biblical phrase is Am Segula, a treasured people, but the function is unmistakable. We were chosen to be a light to the nations, to carry an ethical message into the world, to bring monotheism, the dignity of every human being, the sanctity of life, the rule of law, and the weekly Sabbath to a world that did not have those precious things. Being chosen in the Jewish tradition is not a privilege, it's a burden. It's an obligation. Number 11, what comes in the afterlife? Most people raised in Christian or Muslim cultures assume that the afterlife is the central drama of religious life. Heaven, hell, paradise, damnation, judgment day, eternal reward, or eternal punishment. Judaism is strikingly almost silent on this. Open the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and search for descriptions of the afterlife. You won't find them. There isn't heaven, there isn't hell there. There's no clear teaching about what happens when we die. There are hints, there are references to Sheol, a kind of shadowy underworld that isn't really elucidated in that text. There are later teachings developed in the Talmud and in mystical traditions about Olam Haba, the world to come, and Gan Eden and Gehinnom, Jewish versions of paradise and purgatory. But these are remarkably vague, remarkably restrained, and remarkably unimportant to most Jews and to most of Jewish life. The open door, converts. Throughout this conversation, I've been describing Judaism as a people, as a tradition, as a covenant, and one of the most beautiful and least understood facts about Judaism is this: you can join. Anyone can become a Jew if they're sincere. Anyone of any background, any race, any nationality, any prior religion, with sincerity, with study, with commitment, a person can become a Jew by choice. And once they do, they're not a second-class Jew, they're not a lesser Jew, they are a full Jew.